of our International Talks event, and today Elizabeth Davis is with us. We would like to thank to Elizabeth Davis for accepting our invitation to this, and I want to say thanks to Tufan Karaca again because he assists us in the background during this process. I want to make a few announcements with Elizabeth's permission. Please let's have silence during the event. If you have any question, you can raise your hand. Finally, I want to mention a little bit about who Elizabeth is. Elizabeth Davis, the Dean of the School of Economics and Business Administration at St. Mary's College of California, is a distinguished administrator and scholar with an impressive record in higher education leadership. A respected professor of management, Davis previously served as the Dean of the School of Management at the University of San Francisco, leading all aspects of the school, including financial management, accreditation, fundraising, board leadership, and marketing. She also served as the department's graduate program director and founded the university's Women's Leadership Institute. Thank you again for accepting our invitation. The stage is yours, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Mayra. Really appreciate that. Good evening to everybody in Istanbul. It's one of my favorite cities to visit in the world. And greetings from San Francisco. It's really nice to be with you this evening. And I want to talk a little bit about, the conversation that I think we'll have tonight, really about organizations. And it was interesting to be contacted by Tufan because we first met in 2012 when I was leading a group of MBAs and doctoral students from the George Washington University on a study tour to study organizations in Albania and Romania. So I first met Tufan there, where he gave a presentation on emerging markets in Albania and his perspective on the evolution of organizational development. So it was there that we, struck this alliance, and I was really pleased to be asked to come back and share some observations with this group. Since my time at George Washington University, I have served as a dean in 3 different business schools. So one of the things that my observations are about tonight is not just being a dean and being responsible for the development of, emerging leaders like yourselves around the globe, but also this whole idea of, the evolution of organizations and what's going on in the marketplace today. So I started out in the business world before I even came into academics. So tonight, Kelly, if you will move the slide to the agenda. Thanks. So the outline for my talk tonight is really, if you forward that, is really to talk a little bit about the rise of the corporation, the current push for what we call stakeholder capitalism, the whole idea of what's happening with corporate nation states versus sustainable development and the dynamics in the field right now, how we think we're doing as organizations, what the push around stakeholder capitalism is, and then some possible solutions. And tonight I want to talk a little bit about shifting the mindset to conscious leadership. So let's talk a little bit about, how people are looking at organizations today. So if you rotate the next slide, Kelly, that would be great. Every year for the past 6 years, the Fortune magazine has posted the 2020 top 10 list of organizations that they believe are changing the world and doing well by doing good. So if you punch that up, Kelly, These are the companies this year that Fortune says are changing the world, and not just changing the world, but doing well by doing good. So take a look at this list. The vaccine makers, probably no debate about that. We're all in a pandemic. We're looking for solutions. Some of the major pharmaceutical companies have come forward. But what about Alibaba? What about PayPal, NVIDIA, BlackRock as an investor, Zoom? We've all used Zoom this year to no end. Safari.com, Regeneron. What do you think about this? Do you agree that these are the top 10 companies when you think about companies that are doing good and doing well by doing good? So maybe, Mayra, you could field a few of those comments. So we have one don't agree so far. And why would that be? Everybody believes that the criteria for doing well and doing good are reflected in the policies and the behavior of BlackRock, PayPal, for example, Alibaba. Agree with the vaccine makers, and you think Zoom is doing good. Okay, but what about BlackRock? What about Safari.com? What about Regeneron? Are they even companies that you recognize? PayPal, I'm sure you do. Well, these are things that you need to think about because we're actually pushing through to say these are going to be the icons of the 2020s as we sort of move into this next century. And think about the fact that these are companies that people are voting that are doing well by doing good. So what does it mean then in the 2020 century to be a corporate entity? So Kelly, if you'll move to the next slide. So what is the corporate definition? So when we think about PayPal or we think about BlackRock, what's the definition of a corporation? In the past 100 years, if you'll punch that up for me, Kelly, you know, we think about these organizations as companies or group of people or groups of people that are authorized to act as a single entity. So not a collection, but in American management, when we talk about the corporation, we're talking about the corporation behaving legally as a person. And they're recognized, corporations are recognized as such by the law. So in addition to that, in the evolution and the development of organizations, we also know that by the 1970s, Milton Friedman, who's an economist who won the Nobel Prize for his work in consumer markets, really defined the corporation from the standpoint of shareholder primacy and profits. In other words, you know, BlackRock is in business to what? Deliver profits and return on investment to its shareholders first. PayPal is the same. Amazon is the same. So companies that are formed and companies that transcend national boundaries really identify from the standpoint of a purpose of producing what they call shareholder primacy and profits. So would we agree that that is the purpose and the development of companies today? And there are many people who would argue that we've moved into a new sort of century where perhaps we need to question the whole notion of shareholder primacy and profits. So American companies are really asking about the primacy and purpose of companies today. So let's take a look at what they call the new corporation. And this is a trailer from a very new film that's being posted and hopefully will go global that you should earmark and watch. So Kelly, if we can hit that, we'll look and
the greed economy is killing us.
We are so steeped in this commodification that it's hard to distinguish between being a consumer and being a citizen.
Seeing the documentary The Corporation, it opened my eyes.
Calling corporations psychopaths absolutely had an impact.
Can we take the resources of corporations and get them to focus on the needs of the poor?
There is no such thing as corporate social responsibility.
They literally play casino with life on Earth.
The changes that we feared are coming faster than anybody thought. It's completely out of control. Corporations have figured out there are really big business opportunities in these public sectors.
Private schools for the poor is a $51 billion a year market.
Take the education system, take the healthcare system.
That's a direct threat to democracy. Their reach cannot be underestimated. They know everything about us.
If we don't push back, we're going to live in a world in which they are governing us privately for the profit motive.
One of the largest corporate bailouts with as few strings as possible in American history. Shameful.
Global pandemic. What do we do now? Let's do a tax cut.
The pandemic revealed that we need to contain corporate power.
The democracy is trying to breathe. We can't breathe because of the weight of poverty on our neck.
We have not come here to beg world leaders to care. Change is coming, whether you like it or not.
Are you actually going to challenge the power of corporations? This is what the 2020s will be about.
You have to really ask yourself, what was your role in this moment in history?
so you do have to ask yourself, what will your role in history be? And this is a big debate going on in American management right now. The whole notion of the role of the corporation and its role in sustainable development. But the conversation has gone beyond, something like the new corporation. And it's begun to spread on a global scale, the whole dialogue around sustainable development. But in that context, what it means to be a corporation then in this new century. So Kelly, if you'll go to the next slide. This has pushed forward this whole idea of moving from shareholder primacy to what they call stakeholder capitalism. Why and why now? If we look at the Fortune, let's say, top 10, and we reflect on the kinds of behavior, and then we take something like the new corporation and the behavior of the corporations that are global in nature. They're no longer just American corporations. These are global corporations. This whole idea of stakeholder capitalism has gotten some traction. So Kelly, if you'll hit that, what we saw was we have global challenges. And right now the pandemic is one indicator of that, but we also have the bottom of the pyramid to deal with, income equality. So the notion of stakeholder capitalism is this idea that companies now and corporations now must support a wider array of constituents beyond just simply their shareholders. So this is beginning to get some traction and really some conversation about this. And the whole idea of trying to build greater stakeholder value and not just align your activities with shareholder return. The World Economic Forum, so if we go to the next slide, in 2019, in 2000 and Davos 20, began this conversation beyond just simply the SDGs, right? To talk about the 4 pillars of stakeholder capitalism and begin to share that information across the globe for, for policy wonks, but also to integrate the conversation of corporates into this whole idea of stakeholder capitalism. And so the focus of the conversation has become, what would be the principles of governance if we look at stakeholder capitalism? And what are the responsibilities of companies then and governing bodies, of leaders, to ensure that they are adhering to stated purposes and behaving ethically on a global scale? What are the commitments in stakeholder capitalism of companies around the whole idea of protecting the planet, knowing that we have finite resources? And if we believe what we see in the new corporation, we haven't made a whole lot of progress in sustainable development. And what about people? And how can we set up the conditions from a stakeholder capitalism standpoint to begin to eliminate some of these society problems in global poverty and hunger, and ensure that people really have the ability to fulfill their potentials? And then this whole idea of prosperity. Does the company's practices really support people's abilities to live and prosper and fulfill their lives? So the World Economic Forum has set up the conditions to have this kind of dialogue. And it's really pushed forward then from Davos and the World Economic Forum to American management in the form of the Business Roundtable. So Kelly, if you'll move that forward. So the Business Roundtable is really a corporate lobbying firm and organization in American management, which collectively meets on a regular basis. And in 2019, a group of the CEOs of some of the largest corporations really got together to really talk about this whole idea of reformulating the purpose of, of business and corporate purpose. And these are some of the principles that they talked about of the new purpose of the corporation, which, by the way, is consistent with some of the things around stakeholder capitalism. But it also focuses in on Americans, really sort of reaffirming that the free market economy is prime in this dialogue, allowing each person to really succeed through hard work and creativity. It also talks about a reformulation of the purpose of the corporation, that each and every company should serve its own corporate purpose and share that fundamental commitment of purpose to its stakeholders, with the idea that you're really moving and fostering diversity and inclusion and delivering value to your customers. And at the same time, investing investing in your employees. In other words, ethically treating your employees as stakeholders in the company. So if you'll move to the next slide. Dealing fairly and ethically with your suppliers is another part of this new purpose of the corporation, and being good partners in that process. Generating long-term value for shareholders is another primacy in the purpose of the corporation in this new definition, and really reaffirming that stakeholders are essential and committing to delivering value. But even with all the work that's been done in Davos and the work that's been done by the World Economic Forum, and now this reformulation of the purpose by the Business Roundtable, there really continues to be some argument, if we go back to the new corporation, what's the reality given the rhetoric that we're seeing right now in American management? So there are skeptics around American corporations and American businesses really sort of adhering to this new purpose statement around stakeholder capitalism. So if you go to the next slide. So this purpose statement was signed by about 181 of the 183 largest corporations of the Business Roundtable in 2019. And these CEOs reaffirmed that they have a responsibility beyond their shareholders. So the statement since 2019 has been reaffirmed by many of the corporate businesses. And there's a sense that this is a step toward improving the perception of businesses as being solely driven by creating shareholder value through short-term profits. But have things really changed? So here's what the skeptics say. If we go to the next slide. Critics and skeptics of stakeholder capitalism argue that really until we have corporate accounting and governance rules really change, that shareholder primacy will still be supreme in the marketplace. So for all the activities and all the rhetoric around the shifts and change, in American management, the argument is that, from a corporate accounting standpoint, until we begin to shift those governance rules and corporate tax laws, for example, that there's very little shift. Skeptics also say that, the Business Roundtable is a statement of just a truism. In other words, a statement that really says, why wouldn't you adhere to this kind of purpose statement in this day and age and in the 21st century? It makes sense. It's good business. But in fact, are we reflecting the shift and change that we want to see? And the other critics say that what's significant really about the statement of the Business Roundtable is what it really doesn't say, right? It doesn't say that American management and corporations are really weakening their fiduciary responsibilities to their boards and managers in favor of moving to producing greater stakeholder value. It in fact reaffirms the ordinary sort of primacy of the for-profit shareholder and that shareholder benefit remains prime. And stakeholder capitalism is nothing more than really greenwashing. But is that in the face of this, and given corporate behavior, stakeholder capitalism continues to move forward for a variety of reasons. So if you move to the next slide. This has given rise to a dialogue that is parallel to stakeholder capitalism, which is much more about the evolution of what they call conscious capitalism. So there's a movement in American management to really sort of reaffirm the basic tenets of stakeholder capitalism by having a dialogue around what they call how we create organizations through conscious capitalism. And many companies that have adopted this sort of set of principles in conscious capitalism have really begun to see that conscious capitalism can create a competitive edge and an advantage for the bottom line by operating ethically and being socially responsible. So what is conscious capitalism then? And how is it different or not from a stakeholder capitalism. So if you go to the next slide. So conscious capitalism is really about a mind shift, and a mind shift from a leadership standpoint in companies today. So while we need to make the shifts in the, corporate enterprise around governance, tenets, and actual accounting principles and finance, it also calls for a mind shift for leadership to move in the direction of building conscious business enterprises with people who really follow a business strategy where they're looking to generate strategy that benefits both human beings and the environment. And there are proponents, certainly, in American management of conscious capitalism. The rise of conscious capitalism we've seen in the dialogue in the past, I would say 10 years. And the model looks a little bit like this. So if you move to the next slide. It's that if we build conscious businesses, we really need to build leadership philosophy and mind shifts around socially responsible economic and political philosophy about how we establish our businesses, not just the practices of business. It's really about shifting the mindset around philosophy to really say that businesses should operate ethically by serving all the interests of stakeholders involved, not just corporate management and shareholders. So the conscious business really reflects socially responsible action and a philosophy around how you build the business itself. And so when we talk about conscious capitalism, we're talking about the confluence of formulating purpose, stakeholder involvement, leadership philosophy, and the actual culture of the organization to create this conscious business, who could then sort of enact stakeholder capitalism tenets. So if we go to the next slide, so conscious capitalism, can it work? Because it's really about a mind shift. It's not about just practices. It's a business philosophy. So it's not about corporate social responsibility or implementing a social venture program as an add-on. It's really a business philosophy about how you establish your business, how you run your business. And it has this dual mandate. From a business strategy standpoint and philosophy standpoint that says you have to build a stakeholder and shareholder orientation philosophically as you move forward. And it means you, when in the formulation of corporate purpose, you have to serve a higher purpose. And at the same time, look for ways to effect a return for your shareholders. But it has to be built as a dual mandate, not an afterthought, right? And it has to focus on social justice. So when we go back and we think about the fundamental principles and tenets of stakeholder capitalism, it really says when you build the philosophy and purpose of the company, you have to focus an intent on social justice to really make stakeholder capitalism work in the field. And it has to also tie in customer social and emotional loyalty to a commitment around meaning. So when we talk about this whole idea of social justice, sustainable development, we have to bind that into the kinds of products and services that we actually offer to our customers to build that kind of loyalty, to build sustainability in this next century. So it's a real challenge because it calls for a mind shift, not just an add-on program, not just a fundamental sort of social venture program in stakeholder capitalism. It can't be what we would call in American management a greenwashing program to make people feel better and maximize shareholder return. And there are big questions in American management still about how many companies have fundamentally made this shift to conscious business practices, conscious business philosophy, and stakeholder capitalism, and can we do it? There are some new models on the horizon. And one of the proponents of this is Colin Mayer from the British Academy in Europe. So most recently in 2021, if you'll rotate to the next slide, he offers us a way to begin to think about how we build purposeful businesses, conscious businesses, and the dimensions that we need to look at to reinforce this shift in mindset or build companies that actually are purposeful from the get-go. And it involves taking a look at all the dynamics of ownership, regulation, governance, how you measure the delivery of purpose for the company, what performance measures are relevant, what about the finance, risk and capital, is that aligned with purpose for shareholders and stakeholders? And so we have the beginnings of new models for problem solving the problems of people, planet, and not profiting from creating problems. So if we go back to the new corporation and the trailer, how do we begin to end, the capitalist sort of fundamental sort of free market economy that we see and the business practices of that in American management. So what are the challenges then for management in the field? And what do we think about when we think about all of you who are practicing or getting ready to practice as leaders in the field? What are some of the critical things that we need to have dialogues about? So the next slide. Thanks, Kelly. We need to create high-performing organizations, no doubt about it. But as emerging leaders, you need to think about, how you're creating a culture of trust and respect in your organizations and where you are along the continuum. Are you reinforcing purpose? Are you creating systems of flexibility and balance? And are you valuing all people in the company? We have a lot of movement in American management around business practices of diversity and inclusion, but you have to come to the table with the ability to create that kind of trust and respect if in fact we want to move to creating conscious capitalists and affecting, stakeholder capitalism outcomes. We also, and I would say to everybody in the room, and there are more than 200 of you in the room today, all of whom are probably in organizations or you're students of business practice right now. Developing your leadership skills, and we need leaders who can listen and reflect and are purposeful in your own practice. Putting people first and keeping human beings in the middle of, in the center of the equation becomes a really important practice, I think, for emerging leaders. And making space in your organizations for innovation is another dynamic. We need creative solutions for the 21st century. Building stakeholder value, trying to practice socially responsible development and decision-making, and really understanding the system dynamics of the individual, the organization, and the environment, how everything is interrelated. And I don't mean just people, I mean ideas, practices, events, how you connect that in your own leadership practice in your organizations. So what are we doing at St. Mary's? As the Dean of a business school, and I think about this on a regular basis. How do we educate this next generation, and what are we doing as a business school? So we go to the next slide. Our tagline at St. Mary's is, how do we produce leaders who can think globally and lead responsibly? So in our curriculum, we're binding systems thinking and talking about socially responsible behavior. We're building in our curriculum sustainability practices, and we're having that dialogue with young leaders around how to build stakeholder orientation in organizations. We're also getting our young leaders to practice reflective management exercises. In other words, how are you building your leadership philosophy? We're actually asking our young leaders, both undergraduate and our graduate students, to really be reflective and really practice journaling, doing this, building your leadership practice around socially responsible behavior through exercises and journaling. We're doing a lot of simulation in the classroom around social justice, socially responsible behavior. What does it mean? What does it look like? And we're actually doing a fair amount of role playing with our students, both undergraduate and graduate. Case studies in ethical decision-making, ethical dilemmas, principled leadership, what does it mean? Immersions, global mindset. Many of our programs require and encourage our students to do study tours, to really have that exposure to others and to build cultural competence. And then we're doing professional development with a social focus and workshops on responsible management. In the end, you know, from a business school standpoint, we need to educate and provide you with all the tools and techniques around what I would call the languages of business. What does it mean? What does marketing mean? You know, what does finance mean? How do we begin to think about production and operations? But most importantly is the mindset that you come to the table with when we think about creating those business practices. So in the end, what we hope is that we're building these conscious leaders and putting almost 1,000 students into the marketplace annually at St. Mary's in the business school, with the hope that, if you go to the next slide, Kelly, that we have practicing leaders, and we're putting out young leaders and experienced leaders and emerging leaders and executives who are realigning their organizations with the principles of conscious capitalism and stakeholder capitalism. In other words, having those conversations about business and the deeper purpose of business and in their own companies. Also, trying to reinforce the mind shift that business exists as an interdependent system, creating value for all stakeholders. And that conscious leaders, and you as leaders in the 21st century, are there to serve the organization's purpose, but with a purpose of creating value for all the company's stakeholders. So I leave with a quote before I open this up to conversation. So Kelly, my last slide. When you reflect on what you want to do with the opportunities ahead of you, remember that it really is possible to do well for yourselves and do good for others. That's the mark of real achievement in business, and more importantly, in life. So thank you, and I'll open the floor for questions. Looks like we have a lot in the chat room.
Thank you, Elizabeth. There are one question on the chat. Okay, I said it. Okay, I read it. How can I create a new culture in a company with more empowered and larger people than I am, and how can I get them to comply?
That's a really good question that I often hear in the classroom. You know, and I'll go back to the quote that was ended in the trailer for the new corporation. You know, you need to, even within the sphere of the small influence that you have currently in your own company, you can change the behavior and practice of the culture of your team, of your department, of your own behavior as you deal and communicate up the line. You have to start somewhere. And even in the smallest sphere of influence that you have in your company, or even in your dealing with your relationships with other people, it has to start there. That's part of the mind shift. So start small, start where you are with changing the behavior of the people around you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. There are a question. You can ask your question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation, Ms. Davis, and for your precious thoughts. I actually took one class and it was called Climate Change and Business. And we talked about a transformation, which, as you described, a shift in mindset. And I think we can conclude them on the same page. And do you think that us as leaders and now as students, if we were to act more conscious and without greenwashing and without trying to increase the brand image and so on, do you think that on the topic of a more sustainable world, do you think that the world has a chance in the worlds of organizations and businesses if we can change and transform?
I really do. Last week, I was part of a presentation with the Commonwealth Club here in the US, which was broadcast. And we talked about that particular issue. You know, I think now more than ever, we have the opportunity to take a lot of what we're seeing as stakeholder pressure for change into the evolution and the change of business and the way it's done. So in America, it's been, you know, the pressure for stakeholders with racial injustice, for example. It's been the pressure around, you know, the sustainable development and the business practices of corporations that violate climate change. I'm here in California, and I can tell you that the Climate Action Group and the groups here in California have really launched a tremendous amount of pressure for change in the way companies actually do business. You as a young leader then, this is about really pulling together. It's not enough for us to expect that things will change simply by consumers voting with their feet. It's going to take more than that. It will take the pressure of stakeholders, and public opinion. It will take customers, it will take employees, and it will take leaders like yourself who are willing to take the first steps towards change, knowing that you have tremendous support. But it is about building that trust in coalitions that are going to be required for us to move forward in sustainable development. I spent a fair number of years with National Science Foundation grants working in climate change and climate action in the business world when I was at George Washington University. So I'm very supportive and very much a proponent. But business must take on some of this responsibility, but shift their philosophy. So this is about, once again, harnessing, some of this pressure that we're seeing from stakeholders. And we're trying to do that in California. As a business school, I really think we have a responsibility to really make sure our own students and leaders really recognize this and use this to our best ability to shift things.
I also think that education is the key, but at one point, we as individuals can become incapable at one point because we are not as strong as companies. So we can protest, we can react, but the shift needs to be within the companies and businesses.
Well, and it is the opportunity, if you're in the business world now, to really begin to harness that conversation with your colleagues in other companies. The other thing I would say is, I believe that education is a vehicle for that change. I wouldn't be here, I'd still be in the business world if I believed that business alone could enact that change. I do think universities play a major role and business schools play a major role in that mind shift. As alumni of those universities in Turkey, and I've visited quite a few of them on my trips to Turkey, here's the time when you're as an alum, that you can bring that voice back to the university to be heard and to establish that dialogue as alumni back in your own institutions. And it really will have impact.
You're welcome at any time after this is all over.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Yeah. Other questions that people have or ideas that you want to share?
Mahmoud,
I see other hands up.
Yes. Mahmoud, you can ask your question.
Thank you. Hello, first of all, thanks for this presentation. It's so valuable for me. I want to ask, what is the new age requirement for business? With pandemic situation, everything's changed suddenly, and requirements also change. I just wondered, can you give some advice to improve my skills? What should I do? And also, I want to wonder, this is a little bit out of the topic, but I'm just wondering your opinion. What's gonna happen crypto money? There was a new idea, crypto money, and it will be took, I guess, real money. And what is your opinion about this situation? Thanks for your answer.
Okay. So skills. What skills do you really need we've been in a pandemic for almost a year. In California, we've been locked out and locked down now, almost a year. We're heading on 11 months. I'm not sure what the situation is in Istanbul, but I suspect you're not far from the situation we have here. So when we talk to, students and we talk to young leaders, we are talking about really making sure that the leaders of today really understand technology. So technology and your technological skills and business analytics is really, really important, so that you know how to, deal with data on a large scale. So big data, and that's been around for quite a while, but that need has not gone away. And so any opportunity that you have to upgrade your skills around understanding coding and big data, I think will be helpful. But I think the other piece that we hear time and time again, and even during the pandemic, we just did some survey work with employers here in the California area. And what do the California employers say they want from a skill set? They want leaders who are capable of managing and leading human systems, humans, not just technology. How any opportunity to improve your communication skills, both written and oral, any opportunity for you to upgrade your skills in understanding how to coordinate working with people is really, really important. Any opportunity you get to upgrade your skills in thinking about your own leadership practice. These are the things that employers say are critical skills that they need, in the workplace. And as a faculty member who's taught international management and transnational management, I will tell you that the other key dimension, I think, from a career development standpoint, is your ability to sort of transcend boundaries from a cultural competence standpoint. I think those, the global mindset and the cultural competence are other skills that you as a group need. I talk to and have for years with my own graduate students and undergraduates and said, the things that we can do to expand and get you to understand strategically, the global strategy development and how to work across boundaries are equally as important skills. So while much of the marketplace would push you to upgrade your skills in technology, and I wouldn't disagree, you need to know what R is, you need to know what Python is, need to know how to code to a certain degree, right? How to create an app.
Right.
Yeah, you also need these other skills, which are really linked to this whole idea of stakeholder capitalism. How are you going to communicate? How are you going to lead? So any opportunity that you get for exposure to having that dialogue or talking with others about the skills and cultivating those skills, I think are really important. Now I'm talking like a dean. Cryptocurrency, though. Yeah, and your crypto money question, I'm not a finance professor, so I shudder to respond to that particular question. I can tell you this, there's a big debate here in the US about the value of cryptocurrency and crypto monies. People are really questioning the value of that right now. What the outcome and what the arguments are, you're probably in a better position to talk about that. So I won't weigh in.
Okay, I understand. And thanks for your answer. And it will be so important for me. I text the note and I will search everything.
Good.
Good night. Good night.
Any other questions?
Hi, Liz. May I come in?
Yeah.
I don't want to get into the criticism of this, but as far as I remember, McKee has written the book in 1415, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Conscious Capitalism. I read it the first year that it was published. Mm-hmm. I was living in States between 17 and 18 in Atlanta, and I witnessed Amazon acquiring Whole Foods. And I had witnessed Whole Foods becoming Amazon Foods. You know what I mean? I mean, Whole Foods is not the Whole Foods anymore.
That's right. That's right.
So I had the feeling that the long-going conflict between shareholder and stakeholder is not going to end like by the change of the leaders, because leaders are on the payroll of the shareholders. They will always. So we need some incentives. In North Europe, governments are offering a lot of tax returns for companies who build or import stuff that can be fixed. Right now, electronics, we just throw them away, we buy a new one. But fixing them is a very important green thing to do.
Right.
So if we do not get our support from the shareholder, who is the owner of the government in one sense, nothing is going to happen.
Right.
Before I end, I just want to say, I want to get into the etymology of company. Most probably, most of the young people who are here won't know this. In English and Italian, company and compagnia come from cum panis, sharing bread together. And it's not like that anymore. I don't know if it started like that. It's another question. In Swedish, näringslivet derives from nourishment for life. In Chinese, it means giving meaning to life and vitality. And in Korean, business means causing karma. We lost all of that, didn't we?
Well, so let me respond to your statement, because I think you're right on target, Tufan. This is at the heart of the dialogue about the viability of something like conscious capitalism. I don't disagree with anything you've said. I mean, if we go back and take a look at, the new corporation movie, and that's going to be released fairly soon, I would, and I think it'll be released onto Netflix, which, folks here can see. It's circulating now in Canada, due to be released in the US very soon. But I think the point there, and the dialogue I had last week with the author of this book on the new corporation was just that. Are we ever really going to see change unless we shift the primacy from shareholder to stakeholder? And how would we actually do that is the question, And the dialogue last week was really around, getting government to really take a larger role in the process of redefining what the corporation actually means. In other words, how do we begin to regulate and build, new laws so that, we don't have this situation where large corporations, for example, like Amazon, are paying literally no taxes and have 40% market share in web services on a global scale. How do we do that? And so, the argument last week was government intervention is going to have to step in to help in this regulation process. And, and I don't disagree with that. I think we will need government's help to redefine, what the purpose of the corporation is going to be. And I was on the panel with a couple of lawyers, so they themselves, agree with this. And my only argument is, at the same time that we begin to take on some of this whole idea of reformulating sort of the tenets and principles legally of corporations, we also need a group of emerging leaders and young leaders like this group who shift the mindset in the process. This won't happen overnight. You know, I've met Raj Sisodia. I met him in 2011 when he first published this work on conscious capitalism. You know, quite frankly, I have very little sort of allegiance to the label as much as I have allegiance to this whole concept of better engagement and better primacy in business philosophy and practice around creating stakeholder value. Call it what you want, you know, creative capitalism. We have Salesforce here in San Francisco who, you know, with Benioff, who is trying to implement some of these business practices and bring a mindset that's new and different. So I think it has to be a 2 to 3 prong strategy in the end. I think you're right. But for this group, we need to affect that change of mindset in business philosophy to begin with. Otherwise, if we don't start in the education process, we're not going to have the mindset that's going to establish a change even legally going forward. And quite frankly, I don't think the globe can sustain this kind of damage long term. I think, you know, I think we have a lot on the table with this. That's my soapbox.
Thank you.
Okay, Melik Shah, you can ask your question.
Okay, firstly, thank you for the presentation. I had 2 questions, but you answered the first one. So I will ask the second one. As a professor of economics, what do you think about the GameStop in accidents, you know, incidents? Or do you know the problem, you know, about the GameStop?
Oh yeah, I do, of course. That's been a flurry of dialogue here in the US with GameStop and its impact on Wall Street. You know, I think it's very interesting that we have a group of very, very small investors who've collectively, you know, taken over basically Wall Street. And I think to some degree, let me go back and say, you know, that here you have sort of stakeholders in action. So at the highest level of abstraction, you know, you have a collective of stakeholders in a particular, you know, industry that collectively have sort of put pressure on the system. That's been a bit of a wake-up call. Wall Street never expected that. Wall Street is, I lived in New York for many years. And, you know, Wall Street's philosophy is very, very prominent from an American management standpoint. In fact, you know, the philosophy there really permeates many of the business schools. And the practices. So I take this as a wake-up call to Wall Street that they need to sort of rethink what they're doing, and for the stakeholders themselves to know that they can have impact in collective action. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's actually a good thing.
Okay, thank you for coming.
I'm sorry, Tufan?
Aren't they the ones who started Occupy movement?
Aren't they the ones that started? I didn't hear what you said.
Who started the Occupy Wall Street movement about 5 years ago?
Yeah.
Or 10 years ago?
Yeah, 10 years ago. That's right. Right. That's right. So, you know, once again, I think, you know, more than ever, we have this sort of pressure building on a global scale for change. And this group of young people are right in the middle of all of this pressure as it builds. And so my concern is that you're prepared to be a part of that change. So I'll go back to, you know, the new corporation. Where were you? What were you doing? And what was your contribution?
And push pressure.
Yeah, it's time. It's time to make some shifts and changes. And you folks are the next generation to do that. And from an educational standpoint, I'd like to see you do that with stakeholder orientation in mind, and not simply shareholder primacy. Other questions?
Okay, if you have a question, you can raise your hand. Okay, Irem, you can ask your question.
I'm sorry for the second time question, but
no.
My question, I want you to answer from a perspective of a dean. I would like to attend the graduate program in the near future, in the next year actually. And what would you look in a motivation letter, and how can the students show that they are motivated? You know, I Google it and I search for ideas, but I think it's really valuable to hear from a real dean and a successful woman as you.
Thanks for the question, because I will tell you, you know, as a dean, very often we have the opportunity to read essays that are written, you know, by students for admission purposes. Mm-hmm. And the essays that people write really have to do with this whole idea of what have you identified sort of your greater purpose, and how would this graduate education help you to further that purpose that you have in mind. And those are probably the most salient essays. Those are the ones that in the admission standards, people say, this person has identified, you know, what they would like to do, and then have made an argument how this education will help them to get to this next level. And that's what you need to, I think, to think about is, you know, the meaning of the education tied to what you want to do or what you think you want to do from a career standpoint. And it depends also between, you know, doctoral students versus master's students. You know, now I'm talking, you know, graduate students at the master's level, because most of the graduate students at the master's level are tied to practice. So the degrees are terminal in the sense that they help you in business practice or nonprofits or, you know, I don't know, data science, you know, and so forth. Doctoral programs are different, and the essays there are different because the purpose is different. But I will also tell you that if you're interested in, you know, studying in the United States, you know, the universities in the United States are very, very interested in having international students in their classrooms to actually have the dialogue and develop, you know, a global perspective for our own students. So, you know, international students play a really critical role for us. Let me know if you're interested.
Thank you.
We have 9 graduate programs. Anybody else?
Faruk wants to ask a question. Faruk, you can ask your question.
Hello, Mr. Davis. I have just one question. How is democracy related to capitalism?
I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Okay. How is democracy related to capitalism?
How is democracy related to capitalism? Well, do you have another 5 days? We could talk about that. So that's a big topic, right?
Yes.
You know, and I think that, you know, democracy is really about people, or encouraging people to have a vote in the structure and the way not just work is done, but the way we live. And democracy becomes really important beyond just simply establishing, you know, laws. It really is a statement about, you know, how you want to live. Capitalism and the free market economy is one sort of dimension of thinking about democracy. That's, you know, a dimension of, you know, how do you want to do business? So it's related in the sense that, you know, when we look at the corporation, and I said for the last 100 years, you know, what did democracy do? It established a definition of the corporate purpose with shareholder primacy, which was linked to an understanding of the evolution of a free market economy. In other words, buying into that concept. So it's an expression of the democracy. But if you look at what's happening in the US right now, and you look at the pressures that have come forward, it says that the democracy is not functioning as well as it should. And one dimension of that, and one spin-off of that, will be, you know, the evolution of business. So when Tufan says, you know, change won't come until we begin to think about government and government law, he's right. But from an American perspective, that will come through democracy voting on new laws to enact that deal with not just business, but racial injustice. What does that actually mean? You know, so it's not about just about, let's say, business practices, but it's about, you know, how you treat your neighbor. Who is your neighbor? Where does your neighbor live? And, you know, just how we choose to live. So it's a huge debate right now. I mean, if you've monitored what's been going on in the United States, you know that. You know, some of the riots that we've had around the way people are treated. And that's a real statement and a democratic statement that the system's not working, you know?
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, do you have any question?
Any more questions before we close this out?
Okay.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's been wonderful.
Ezgi have a question.
Oh, somebody has a question.
But Ezgi, you can. Okay.
Ezgi? Can't hear
no,
you.
We
You're
can't
muted.
Hear you.
There.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. Actually, I wonder that if you return, if you wanted to return your university years, what would you like to change and how would you improve yourself? I wonder that because I study at business administration, it's important for me. I wanted your advice now.
Well, I'm not sure what the question is. So ask me again.
Okay. If you wanted to return university years, what would you like to change? How would you improve yourself?
Wow. You know, I did my doctoral work at the Wharton School, and which is a very traditional sort of business school, main line right into Wall Street, as a matter of fact. Little embarrassing that Trump went to Wharton. We don't like to admit that. But, you know, when I think about the history and the journey of my career, I wouldn't have changed a lot. I learned so much along the way. The failures that I've had, the successes that I've had. And in my years of teaching strategy, let me say this. When I first came in from the business world, and I really was a product of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania and the thinking around strategy, I actually taught strategy much more from the shareholder capitalistic standpoint. And so I spent a fair number of years teaching that way, which I think, you know, sort of reinforces this whole idea of, you know, controlling outcomes, and not always putting the human center in the center, or humans in the center of the decision-making process. I really, you know, when I finally understood that from an academic standpoint, a business standpoint, and all those things, it really caused me to shift the way I taught, and to really sort of rethink my own fundamental philosophies. So I think your question and the constant questions from students around these issues have been sort of an education for me. And would I change any of that? No, at all. It's made me shift and think, you know, my own philosophy over the years. So I don't know that that's really what you wanted to hear, but I think, you know, it's sort of an honest answer that I wouldn't change much. I've learned so much from business people, from executives. I'm a former executive myself. The things I've studied, the students who've been in my classrooms. So thank you for asking.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Anybody else?
Okay. Elizabeth, thank you. This is a really great presentation. And I want to say thank you, Kelly, too, because she has you in the background, and it's really great.